Hi, it's Doug Atkinson, and we are here at Solutions Review, and today we're talking about roadmaps, and in particular roadmaps for mobility management. How do you go about assessing your situation, finding the right solution, and ultimately implementing? And a lot of companies these days, particularly in the mid-market, are faced with trying to select a mobility management solution, and so we're here to help with that. And we've got an expert, and our expert is Paul Troisi from Troy Mobility. Paul, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Doug. Happy to be here.
I'm glad you're here. You sent us over some notes, which we're going to use to cheat our way through this a little bit. But it's really, the mobility space has really been evolving over the past several years. I mean, you know, it started out, there were multiple operating systems, multiple devices, but it's really kind of narrowed down now to effectively two, iOS and Android. Yeah. As a company starts to think about this, and we're not talking about companies that have already kind of solved these big problems, but the companies that are realizing, you know, that it's a scary world out there. There's a lot of things happening, and they need to secure things up a little bit.
Sure.
What are some of the first things that they can do to get started with regard to, you know, assessing their situation?
What we have found that's most effective, Doug, is to really be able to take your organization and take a holistic look at who we are, what we do, what has worked for us previously, and be able to take a good cross-section of your organization, whether it be IT, legal, finance, etc., and be able to get a small little cross-section. It doesn't need to be huge. It just needs to be a cross-section of disciplines within your organization that really functions as that strategic team that's really able to drive a lot of, you know, where are we going, what are we doing, what are our present processes now? The present processes for your finance and HR organization might be very different than your sales and your marketing organization. So really starting from a strategic assessment perspective, really start to take a look at what does our organization look like? Let's baseline this, and let's understand where are we going, and really what is our goal of this mobility project? And that's really got to be the driver here.
Yeah, so, you know, we're really talking about, you know, what size companies, you know, are really kind of the mid-market at this point?
Well, you know, we've been fortunate over the past 8 years to be able to take this cross-section of SMB and mid-market enterprise organizations that, you know, really can range anywhere from 100 users or 100 devices really up to somewhere around that 5,000 user space is really what we define as that SMB in the mid-market. And that's a pretty sizable space when you look at...
That's a huge market.
Yeah, it's a tremendously huge market. You know, where a lot of the Fortune 2000, Global 2000, have already established this is our roadmap and this is what we're doing, and they're entrenched in something already.
Right.
It's really where that mid-market and the higher-end mid-market has now started to dip their toes in and said, all right, we might have a problem, Houston.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, and because they're that size, I mean, certainly at the high end of that, there's many stakeholders involved. At the low end, there's probably one or two.
Right.
But really bringing that team together is really kind of the first step in terms of trying to figure out what you're trying to accomplish, really where you need to start thinking, and what you have currently.
That's absolutely right, and you know, clearly one of the biggest factors that we see when we're dealing with SMB and mid-market is exactly as you said. You know, there might only be one or two stakeholders in there, and you know, certainly as you start to move into that mid-market, clearly you see, hey, you know, we're working tactically on our existing IT initiatives, and mobility is now becoming this, oh, hey, we have to do this project now. So there's not a ton of experience in working with mobility platforms and evaluation of solutions and trying to build a roadmap to move forward. So, you know, you clearly see that dichotomy between, you know, your Global 2000 that might have, you know, rich IT executives that might be well-versed and been there and done that in mobility versus that mid-market which says, hey, we're a little strained here on our resources. We might even be strained a little bit on our budget. What's the best course of action for us to take in order for us to be successful? in this project.
Well, and so with regard to goals, right, short and long-term goals, what are some of the things that companies are thinking about in that sector?
So clearly, the critical application's always been mail. So many organizations say, hey, look, Exchange Active Sync, it's just not cutting it for us. Maybe we have a mix of our corporate liable assets, and we might want to trickle in some of our employee liable devices into the mix. But we know Active Sync is just not going to cut it for us. So we need a way that we can get mail out in a managed fashion. Let's get a managed configuration out there so at least we can control it. Depending upon how your organization is structured, maybe you want to put a proxy in between there so that you're protecting that Active Sync server from being externally accessible. So you can put a proxy or a gateway in between. And then what we're seeing more and more of these days is organizations saying we really want to containerize our data.
Right.
So, is there an application that we can be using? Is it proprietary to the particular mobility vendors out there? Most of the EMM vendors these days have their own, proprietary mail container. And then what we're seeing is the maturity aspect of what's next. We've secured our mail, we've got our infrastructure aligned, we have a nice proxy in between our devices, our Active Sync server. Now what else can we start feeding to our employees in order to make them more productive and effective in the field?
Well, so and with regard to that phrase, our devices, how are companies thinking about it? Is BYOD here, not here? Is it more you take our device and we'll secure that and you can deal with your own device?
Sure.
How are companies that you're seeing thinking about that?
It's interesting that we've seen this evolution over the last 8 years, and it reminds me of peaks and valleys in the Grand Canyons. Right. Okay, it's a constantly early on in the early stages of MDM, where we just needed to protect the device. Yeah. And we saw more organizations say, no, we want to have more control over the device. But things like supervised devices weren't even something there, or Android Enterprise wasn't even anything that was on the radar. So, we then said, okay, well, let's allow our employees to bring their own devices. But that represented challenges with fragmentation in the Android operating system. So how do we level set this configuration so that at least we can get it to you're an HTC or a Huawei device or or an LG device, because Samsung's been the de facto standard out there in Android. So and then what we have seen is just this constant evolution of the technology gets better, so let's allow more BYOD into the enterprise. Oh, there's some additional features that we want to leverage by the handset vendors, the Apples and the Samsungs of the world. Oh great, let's go more corporate owned. And it also depends upon the financial model that you're looking to deploy. That's something that always is a critical component. Are you staged to be able to deal with the life cycle management of a device, of an employee's device? So if you're corporate owned, you need to be prepared to handle the cracked screens and the break fix on these devices.
And that becomes a huge challenge for a large or smaller mid-sized organization.
Absolutely, and you see more and more of the managed services and the managed lifecycle management, really coming into focus where, as an organization that's outside of your company, we can handle that.
Well, and that's something that a company really needs to think about is not only what solution do I want that's going to be on the device, but what kind of service is going to come along with it?
Absolutely.
Can I get when my VP decides to leave their phone somewhere or drops it off the Grand Canyon or wherever it happens, right? How do I get that fixed? Yeah. I mean, who does that? Who's in charge of that?
Sure. Yeah, and there's that whole groundswell going on right now around managed mobility services. And, outside of let's just figure out what the right path is for us and let's figure out what our basic blocking and tackling is, there is that consideration that one needs to consider in the strategy of a mobility project is let's map this out so that we're not only looking at what is 6 months in front of us, but what might 12, 18, 24 months down the road from here really look like.
Well, so you're thinking about your goals. You've got a team together, or at least you've got a couple of people thinking about what we're trying to accomplish here. So the range of solution providers certainly is fairly broad. I mean, we have a buyer's guide at Solutions Review that has, I don't know, 20, 24 of them in there, ranging from, freebies to, fairly expensive full service mobility solutions. So where does that start to happen? Now, how does that start to happen? What is the company really looking to do there in terms of, isolating some solution providers?
Well, clearly Gartner does a wonderful job of identifying it. Solution Reviews does a fantastic job of identifying the strengths and weaknesses of these individual EMM vendors out there. And we always do like to stay closer to the acronym of EMM versus, the traditional MDM, because clearly EMM has taken a much broader focus around application and device security and, the true integrations. So, clearly once you've established what that strategy is going to look like, we understand what our short and our long-term goals are. What we're also seeing in the SMB and mid-market space, Doug, is more and more, organizations saying, hey, look, we want to move away from, putting things in our infrastructure. And you really see this in the SMB space where we say, hey, we can drive a lot of cost effectiveness in deploying cloud solutions. So, do we want to be looking on-prem? Do we want to be looking for cloud solutions? What does that footprint look like? So as you start to evaluate what those goals of the project are, you really want to be mapping an EMM solution that's as close to your future goals around infrastructure and forward-looking thoughts that you can find that map to those goals. But the strong part of that whole evaluation process really becomes one of, if we had a crystal ball and we could foresee what 2 years from now was going to look like, what would we be doing? What would we look like? Would we be doing things like secure app development? Would we be integrating things like identity management solutions? So unfortunately, what you'll find is some of the lower freebies, as you like to call them, aren't going to include that high-end range of additional functionality.
Well, and that's really part of the challenge for a company, is to try to look into the future and try to see through that crystal ball and try to understand what it is that's going to start to happen after they, do the rudimentary securing of a device, because there are a lot of other considerations, and there's certainly a lot of risk associated with not having all those bases covered. Yeah. So with regard to, you've got you're moving down the roadmap, right? We've gotten our team together. We've gotten our short and long-term goals sorted out. We've started to isolate and narrow down a selection of solution providers. How do you then start to go through the implementation process? I mean, walk us through that a little bit. That's what you do all day long.
Sure. Clearly when you start to look at it, I always suggest, based upon those goals and the strategy that you came away from, try and identify 2, maybe 3 the most vendors that you feel are going to fit a majority of that criteria. Once you've been able to narrow that down, take a crack at one. We don't normally suggest trying to do a bake-off side by side because it creates a lot of confusion. Take one that you think is going to fit your needs, go ahead and install and implement that. Make sure that it's working the way you want, and test it out to a cross-section of your enterprise.
And so how many devices might a company of the size we're talking about here, how many might they roll that out to in terms of a test before they deploy?
Yeah, I mean, depending on who that community is going to be, if it's just simply IT running that project, it might only be 5 devices or 6 devices that you take a cross-section of smartphones and tablets. If, on the other hand, you want to make sure that you integrate the steering and the strategy committee that you've established, you might as well just go ahead and, go up 20, 25 devices, make sure that, you deploy and roll that out to those teams to make sure that that's actually going to fit those criteria.
Well, and after they've done that, what are they kind of looking at or looking for as they've started to test? What are some of the things that a company might come across and say, hey, this isn't what we expected?
Sure. So I've always said the first and foremost is usability. Okay, if your end users are not comfortable with the technology you're deploying, the adoption will be significantly less than you want. ultimately, if the end users aren't happy with the way that they're accessing data or doing their job on their devices, ultimately they'll find a circumvention around what you've already put in place. Right. So clearly you want to make sure that usability is at the highest. The second thing that we often suggest strongly is that your support desk, your help desk, be tightly integrated to that rollout. If in the event that there are questions, problems, have that help desk address those questions and problems so they get in the mentality of supporting these users in the field.
So now you've gotten to the point of deployment, you've tested, you're ready to deploy, and you deploy. Is that the end of the line? Is that where it all stops, or do you start to think about more things?
That's where it starts. Okay, again, we've really looked at mobility as being this really highly dynamic and fluid industry. And things are changing so fast in the mobility space. More and more organizations are adopting a smaller profile, a smaller form factor. Tablets, smartphones in the industry are really becoming really supercomputers. They're not even mini computers anymore, supercomputers in which your employees rely on these devices to do their job day in and day out. So, as you start moving forward with these devices, you need to constantly evaluate where you are, what you're doing, accessibility you're providing to your employees, and then also really take a look at that long-term focus and say, do we want to start moving into things like mobile threat protection? Do we want to protect against malicious apps? Do we want to be able to continue to look at things like identity management solutions, et cetera, to be able to take a layered approach to mobile security, as we've liked to say over the years, take a layered approach to that mobile enterprise and constantly evaluate your position going forward.
Because things change. I mean, not only do the devices change, but the operating systems are changing. I mean, they've been changing since mobility's been around. It's continuing to evolve. I know there's both Android's talking about moving everything to Chrome. Apple's talking about moving everything to iOS or some munged new thing, and so is Microsoft with Windows 10 and adding a mobility element as well.
Yep.
And then you have to think about how you start to protect within the network, data within the network. I mean, all the other things: identity management, network monitoring, endpoint protection. It's really become quite a complicated problem.
And then, you're dealing with the elephant in the room where you're dealing with wearables these days, you're dealing with IoT, big data, business analytics. You start putting those on top of your existing mobile enterprise, and now you start dealing with a highly complex living environment.
So what is somebody looking at in terms from start to finish? What do you think a company's looking at in terms of a time frame for saying, okay, we're going to do this to, we've done it?
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different factors that go into that, Doug. I think first and foremost, whether or not that organization is dealing with any compliancy issues. We have GDPR coming up the 25th of May, 2018. So organizations dealing with European data, personal identifiable information, there's a compliancy around that. We've seen organizations move through the process in as quick as 3 weeks. We've seen organizations take as long as 5 months. I think it really depends upon the size, the scope, and if there are any compliancy regulatory requirements that they need to be aware of, that they need to hit that deadline. Our team will work as tight as they possibly can to make sure that we not only find the right solutions, but we hit the deadlines, make sure that we leave ourselves enough runway, to be able to test accordingly and be able to deploy to that user community.
Well, Paul, this has been great. This is exactly the kind of thing that we want to be able to provide our viewers. Our job is really to help buyers buy solutions. That's really what Solutions Review is all about. Certainly what you've laid down here with a roadmap is a path for a buyer to really think about all the pitfalls as they move along on the path of really understanding what they're going to get and select and make the right decision. And that's been great. We would certainly encourage you to check out our Buyer's Guides and Solutions Review. We have them in a variety of categories. Certainly Enterprise Mobility Management is one of them. We have, I think, 20 20 solution providers in our EMM buyer's guide. We would also strongly suggest that you go check out Paul Troisi's company, Troy Mobility, troymobility.com. He is an expert. If you're in the mid-market, he's an expert and really can help you find that right solution that's the perfect fit for you. Paul, this has been great. Thanks very much for coming by. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Doug. It's been great being here.
All
Thank
right.
you.